the glorious, messy, and utterly predictable implosion of ancient Greece. Ancient Greece. When you hear those two words, your mind probably conjures up images of distinguished, bearded men in togas contemplating the nature of existence, sculptors chiseling impossibly perfect abs onto marble statues, and the soaring columns of the Parthenon gleaming under a Mediterranean sun. And 9 times out of 10, the city whispering in your ear is Athens. It's always Athens. Let's be honest, for a solid chunk of history. The narrative of classical Greece might as well have been called the Athens Show, guest starring everyone else. Democracy, an Athenian startup. The Persian Empire's grand tour of the Aegean, halted by a plucky Athenian militia that apparently didn't get the memo they were supposed to lose. The sequel, Persian Boogaloo 2, Electric Zendavesta, a joint production, sure, but you know Athens took top billing over Sparta. The first maritime empire that wasn't just a collection of pirate coves, Athens. The biggest, most drawn-out, and frankly most pointless war in Greek history, a family feud between Athens and Sparta. Philosophy, theater, the art of yelling persuasively in public oratory, all perfected, packaged, and sold under the Athenian brand. Even Diogenes, the original punk rock philosopher who treated public urination as performance art, chose Athens as the stage for his antics. The man had taste. This Athenian power hour. A glorious 170-year-long bender from the invention of democracy in 508 AC2, the moment the kingdom of Macedon showed up to crash the party in 338 BC, has soaked up so much historical limelight that it's a wonder anyone else got a tan. Athens was the imperial capital, the cultural capital, the we're better than you capital. It earned its fame, no doubt. But for the love of Zeus, let's turn the camera around for a second. Let's look at the extras, the supporting cast, the poor saps in the background who were just trying to farm their olives in peace. To truly understand classical Greece not as a highlight reel of Athenian exceptionalism, but as the sprawling, dysfunctional family reunion it really was, we need to zoom out. So let's reframe the story. We tend to see the classical period as this golden age of excellence, the peak of human achievement before the invention of sweatpants. But what if we looked at it as the slow, agonizing, and darkly hilarious failure of the entire system? For 3 centuries, since around the 700s BC, the fundamental building block of Greek civilization was the polis, the city-state. It was a neat self-contained package, a city center for markets and gossip, and a lovely ring of farmland for sustenance. It was a world of small towns, and for a long time, that was enough. They didn't need to be bigger then. The world got very big, very fast. In 546 BC, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, casually strolled over and conquered the Greek cities on the Ionian coast. And there was precisely jack squat any of them could do about it. They were like a collection of feisty chihuahuas trying to intimidate a grizzly bear. They could yap and nip at Persia's ankles, making themselves a general nuisance, and even staging a full-blown revolt in the 490s. But they simply didn't have the muscle to fight back. The cities were just too small. Persia, recognizing that some of the yapping was being encouraged by enablers across the sea, decided to sail over and teach one of them a lesson. That city was Athens. The lesson, however, was not the one Persia intended to teach. In a shocking upset that defied all betting odds, Persia got its imperial posterior handed to it at the Battle of Marathon. Little Athens, running on sheer audacity and a home field advantage, shouldn't have won. It was a fluke, a statistical anomaly. So, when it was time for the rematch a decade later, everyone knew they'd need more than a plucky attitude and a miracle. Winning the Second Persian War required something unprecedented. The most powerful Greek states had to actually work together. This was a monumental effort, like getting a dozen rival tech CEOs to collaborate on a single open-source project. It was the first time they faced a truly existential threat. It wasn't just about cities being burned to the ground, which, by the way, happened with gusto. It was about their entire identity. Becoming subjects of the Persian Empire meant trading in their citizenship. Their very essence as a member of a polis for a line item in an imperial ledger. It meant becoming. Provincial even in victory, that fear lingered. The world was full of big, scary empires, and a single city-state, no matter how proud, was a snack. The solution seemed obvious. If you can't beat the empires, join M, or rather, make one of your own. This is where the trouble really begins. Cities flocked to join mutual defense leagues, which were essentially two competing brands of superpower. The Athenian Delian League Blue Town and the Spartan Peloponnesian League. Redsville, Athens's league, was ostensibly formed to keep kicking Persia out of the Aegean. And for a while it did. There was some campaigning, a weird and ill-advised adventure in Egypt. But for about 50 years, Greece was safe from outsiders. The problem, of course, is that when you eliminate the external enemy, you start noticing how much you dislike your neighbors. The primary threat was no longer an empire across the sea. It was the one you could see from your rooftop. Both Athens and Sparta were more than willing to put the squeeze on the smaller cities under their protection to gain an edge over the other. This arrangement, which began as an alliance, quickly devolved into what can only be described as a protection racket. The moment of realization came in for 71 BC, when the island of Naxos decided it had paid its dues and tried to leave the Delian League. Athens responded by sailing over, beating them into submission, and forcibly dragging them back. A message was sent to the rest of the Aegean. "Oh, you thought this was a club? How cute." No, this is a subscription service, and you can never cancel. Other cities would try their luck, but neither Athens nor Sparta was handing out exit passes. The dearly cherished autonomy of the polis was being systematically flattened. Your city's manpower, your ships, your tributate, all went into the war chest of an overlord who saw you not as an ally, but as an asset. The stage was set for a conflict that would engulf the entire Greek world. They had successfully avoided being conquered by Persia, only to invent new and more creative ways to ruin themselves. The Peloponnesian War. A 3-decade-long family barbecue gone horribly wrong, and so, inevitably, war erupted. Not just a war, but the war. The Peloponnesian War. If ancient Greek history were a TV series, this would be the grim, expensive, multi-season arc where all the fan-favorite characters get killed off. For nearly 3 decades, the Greek world became a canvas for carnage. Greeks had always been pretty good at fighting each other. It was practically a national sport. But those were quick, local affairs, a summer afternoon skirmish over a disputed pasture, home by dinner time. This was different. This was a sustained, multi-generational slog involving massive armies and fleets, protracted sieges, and scorched earth tactics. It was total war, funded by wringing every last drop of wealth from their so-called allies and then setting it on fire. Year after year after year. The immediate loser? After a long and brutal series of blunders, plagues, and one particularly disastrous Sicilian vacation, was Athens. But in a broader sense, everyone lost. The war left the entire Greek world exhausted, impoverished, and deeply cynical. It was like a 30-year hangover, and just when they thought the headache was over, the real nausea began. When Sparta finally bested Athens in 404 BC, they stood victorious atop a mountain of rubble. They had promised the Greek world an age of freedom from Athenian tyranny. What they delivered was a hostile takeover. Sparta confiscated the entire Athenian empire for itself, and in a move of breathtaking hypocrisy, began collecting the same tribute from Athens's former subjects. They didn't even bother to share the spoils with their own long-suffering allies, like Thebes and Corinth, who had done much of the heavy lifting. The victory party was strictly for Spartans only. Sparta's idea of freedom was, turned out, even more oppressive than Athens's protection racket. They installed military governors called harmosts in the cities they liberated. These were essentially glorified thugs, whose job was to make sure nobody got any funny ideas about that gross, icky Athenian invention, democracy. They were there to enforce loyalty, crush dissent, and ensure the tribute payments flowed on time. In doing so, they casually dismantled the political fabric of Greece. The polis, once the proud vessel of a citizen's identity, was now just an administrative unit in an exploitative empire, a franchise location for Spartan supremacy. The age of the city-state was over. The age of the hegemon had begun, and it was miserable. Hegemony whack-a-mole and the Persian bank of chaos so. As we stumble into the 300s BC, we have a new world order. One state, Sparta, is the undisputed top dog, the sole superpower. This is, ironically, the exact outcome the Greeks had fought so desperately to avoid a century earlier with Persia. They had become the very thing they swore to destroy. The problem for Sparta, however, is that their dominance was built on a foundation of sand, resentment, and a complete lack of social skills. Greece was about to invent a new political game: deck the leader. The rules were simple. Whoever is currently on top, everybody else gangs up on them. Round 1 began almost immediately. Sparta's jilted allies, Thebes and Corinth, were absolutely furious about being left out of the victory spoils. They were so angry, in fact, that they were willing to ally with anyone to get revenge. This included their old arch-nemesis, Athens, and, in a twist worthy of a soap opera, the original existential enemy, Persia. Yes, Persia. The Persians, it turned out, were playing a much smarter, longer game. They had realized that conquering the Greeks was expensive and tiresome. Why invade when you can simply finance their self-destruction? They sat back, opened their checkbook, and gleefully funded whichever side seemed most likely to prolong the chaos. They became the official sponsors of Greek violence. When Athens and its new friends started doing a little too well against Sparta, Persia simply sighed, switched sides, and started funding the Spartans. This forced a peace treaty where everyone ended up weaker than they started, which from Persia's perspective was an absolute win. This brilliant, simple, devastatingly effective playbook would define Greek politics for the next 3 decades. Round 2 kicked off in 378 BC Athens. Feeling nostalgic, decided to get the band back together and launched the Second Athenian League. Meanwhile, Thebes managed to kick its Spartan garrison out of the city in a spectacular coup. Thebes then went on to do the unthinkable. In 371 BC, they met the Spartan army in a straight-up hoplite battle and won. This wasn't just a victory. It was a sacrilege. The Spartan army was supposed to be invincible. Thebes didn't stop there. They marched into Sparta's own backyard, liberated their entire enslaved population of helots, and set them up in their own fortified city. This single move crippled Sparta permanently, robbing them of their agricultural workforce and saddling them with a bitterly hostile neighbor. To add insult to injury, Thebes also organized the surrounding cities into a new league to keep Sparta permanently boxed in. It was a masterclass in strategic humiliation. But now, of course, Thebes was looking pretty powerful. A little too powerful if you ask the Athenians and the now humbled Spartans. You can see where this is going. Round 3. Athens and Sparta, the ultimate frenemies, teamed up against Thebes. This culminated in the Battle of Mantinea in 362 BC, the largest hoplite battle in Greek history. It was a rare double knockout. Thebes lost its genius general Epaminondas, and Sparta lost what was left of its army. By the end, all sides were utterly exhausted, like 3 punch-drunk boxers leaning on each other in the final round. No one could take Thebes's place as the new hegemon. The cycle of self-sabotage had finally burned itself out, leaving a power vacuum. From this perspective, the classical era looks less like a golden age and more like a long, drawn-out bar fight where everyone gets glassed. And in a way, it was. But something else was happening beneath the surface of all this glorious, idiotic violence. The culture that just wouldn't quit this entire period is a step-by-step, agonizingly public demonstration of the obsolescence of the city-state, the very institution that had defined and organized Greek civilization for centuries was proving itself spectacularly unfit for the new, larger world it found itself in. That's the tragedy simmering just beneath the shiny surface of the Athenian Golden Age. It provides the crucial context for what happens next. Just 3 years after the mutual annihilation at Mantinea, a man named Philip II takes the throne in a backwater kingdom to the north called Macedon. He enjoys the distinct luxury of invading a Greece that is at its absolute weakest, most divided, and most demoralized. His subsequent conquest, while impressive, is far less surprising when you realize he was essentially kicking down a door that was already off its hinges. But that's only one way to read the situation. There's another more ironic layer to this story. The whole messy process began because the world got bigger and the polis was too small. The Greeks tried to build something bigger to meet the threat, and the result was a century of chaos and self-immolation. Yet, by the time Philip's even more famous son, Alexander, was done with his whirlwind tour of Asia, Greece found itself at the heart of a vast empire, a shape it would retain, in one form or another, for the next 1,500 years. The tragedy of the classical period is that the Greeks, in a desperate attempt to preserve their civic way of life, dove headfirst into its undoing. Their culture had outlived their society. And here's the punchline. The culture didn't just outlive the society, it outgrew it. While the politicians and generals were busy playing their game of imperial whack-a-mole, something remarkable was happening in the background. The golden age of Athens in the 400s was spiffy, sure. But the 300s, the century of political decay and endless war, arguably outshone it in cultural brilliance. This was the century that took the foundations Athens had laid, expanded on them, and universalized them, ensuring these accomplishments would last far beyond the fleeting fortunes of whichever city was playing. Shemo el week. This is the century where we see the founding of entire schools of philosophy that would shape Western thought for millennia. Plato and Aristotle weren't just navel-gazing in an Athenian courtyard. They were building intellectual systems. History as a serious genre was being refined by writers like Thucydides and Xenophon, who analyzed the causes and effects of the very chaos engulfing them. Political science became an empirical study. Aristotle literally sent his students out to collect the constitutions of over 100 city-states, creating a database of political failure. Oratory was elevated to a high art form in the speeches of Demosthenes, who passionately warned his fellow Athenians about the looming threat of Philip of Macedon. They didn't listen, of course, but the speeches were magnificent. Medicine was being formalized by Hippocrates and his followers, who argued that diseases were caused by nature, not by angry gods. Even theater evolved, with the rise of new comedy. It's focused on the demostel of this, plus countless innovations in pottery. Sculpture and architecture was happening all across Greece. Hellenic culture was not just surviving, it was accelerating, even as the political structure that birthed it was crumbling. It was detaching itself from the polis. So, when the Macedonian Empire finally arrived and Alexander the Great decided to expand the Greek world all the way to India, Hellenism was ready. It adapted seamlessly to the new, massive scale of this new world. The culture was no longer tied to a specific place. It had become a portable, adaptable, and highly contagious idea. I don't think this transition would have been nearly as smooth if the polis had remained the strong, encompassing institution it once was. The slow death of the city-state left a void, but it was a void that a new, more cosmopolitan Hellenism was perfectly suited to fill. In this case, a bigger, more ambitious kind of Hellenism. So where does that leave us? The classical period was a fleeting, glorious catastrophe. It was a brief moment of triumph for Athens and Sparta, a lasting and profound tragedy for the polis as a political institution, and, in the most ironic twist of all, a triumph in waiting for the Greek culture that would conquer the world long after its creators had exhausted themselves. It's a story of a society so brilliant it could create timeless art and philosophy, and so foolish it couldn't stop itself from repeatedly punching itself in the face. Did you ever hear the tragedy of classical Greece the wise? I thought not. It's not a story the Athenians would tell you. It's an Aegean legend. Classical Greece was a society so powerful and so wise, it could use the polis to influence the citizens to create culture. It became so powerful, the only thing it was afraid of was losing its power, which eventually, of course, it did. Unfortunately, it taught its apprentice, Rome, everything it knew. Then Rome killed it in its sleep. Ironic. It could save others from barbarism, but not itself.